Okay. So we're on chapter 4, text 3. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Om Jnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshuran Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadad Shri Vasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama, Hare Hare. Okay, so here is our verse for today. Sa evayam maya tedya. Are we going to? Sa evayam maya tedya.
Chapter 4, text 3. Apologize.
Yeah, if you, for people with cell phones that have their Veda base or their Bhagavad-Gita thing open, you can follow along. Yoga prokta puratanaha.
Yoga Prokta Puratana.
Yoga prokta puratanaha.
Puratana.
Bhaktosi me sakhacheti. Bhaktosi me sakhacheti. Rahasyam hetaduttamam.
Rahasyam Yetaduttamam.
Rahasyam me hetaduttamam.
Rahasyam Yetaduttamam.
Sa evayam maya tedya.
Sa evayam maya tedya.
Yoga prokta puratanaha.
Yoga Prokta Puratana.
Bhaktosi me sakhacheti.
Bhakto Sime Sakhacheti.
Rahasyam hetaduttamam.
Rahasyam Yetaduttamam.
Sa evayam maya tedya.
Sa evayam maya tejya.
Yoga prokta puratanaha.
Yoga prokta puratana.
Bhaktosi me sakacheti.
Bhakto sime sakacheti.
Rahasyam hetaduttamam.
Rahasyam setad uttamam.
Anyone want to give it a whirl?
Sa evayam maya tejya.
Sa evayam mayatedya.
Yoga prokta puratana.
Yoga prokta puratanaha.
Bhakto sime sakacheti.
Bhaktosi me sakacheti.
Rahasyam hetad uttamam.
Rahasyam hetaduttamam.
Anyone else wants to try? Any smaller Vaishnavas?
Sa evayam maya tedya.
Sa evayam mayatedya.
Yoga prokta puratana.
Yoga prokta puratanaha.
Bhakto si me
Bhaktosi me sakacheti.
sakacheti.
Rahasyam
Rahasyam hi etaduttamam.
hetaduttamam. So the translation reads, that very ancient science of the relationship with the Supreme is today told by me to you, because you are my devotee as well as my friend, and therefore can understand the transcendental mystery of this science. So we can say this responsibly. I'll say a phrase, and then you all repeat, and then we'll...
And is the sound good in the back? Can you all hear Maharaj well?
I think you can slightly increase.
Maharaj, should I turn up the volume or just move the mic? What's your preference?
turn up the volume,
Okay,
because
of course.
the
sorry.
mic's already pretty close.
Yes, that's true. Sorry, Maharaj. How's that?
Nobody knows until I say something. Okay, here we go. Is that any better? It doesn't sound any different. I don't know.
Because you're close up, Maharaj.
What's that?
You hear yourself instead of the speakers.
Oh,
You're right
okay.
there.
Okay. Well, maybe okay.
Or maybe I'm wrong.
All right, so as long as it's okay. That very ancient science
That very ancient science
of the relationship with the Supreme
of the relationship with the Supreme
is today told by me to you,
is today told by me to you,
because you are my devotee,
because you are my devotee,
as well as my friend,
as well as my friend,
and can therefore understand
and can therefore understand
the transcendental mystery of this science.
the transcendental mystery of the science.
Okay, so Prabhupada's given us a purport here. There are two classes of men, namely the devotee and the demon. The Lord selected Arjuna as a recipient of this great science, owing to his being a devotee of the Lord. But for the demon it is not possible to understand this great mysterious science. There are a number of editions of this great book of knowledge. Some of them have commentaries by the devotees, and some have commentaries by the demons. Commentation by the devotees is real, whereas that of the demons is useless. Arjuna accepts Sri Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and any commentary on the Gita following in the footsteps of Arjuna is real devotional service to the cause of this great science. The demoniac, however, do not accept Lord Krishna as he is. Instead, they concoct something about Krishna and mislead general readers from the path of Krishna's instruction. Here is a warning about such misleading paths. One should try to follow the disciplic succession from Arjuna and thus be benefited by this great science of Srimad Bhagavad-Gita. Sa evayam mayatedya yoga prokta puratanaha bhaktosi me sakacheti rahasyam hetad uttama. That very ancient science of the relationship with the Supreme is today told by me to you, because you are my devotee as well as my friend, and can therefore understand the transcendental mystery of this science. So the process of devotional service is being described by Krishna to Arjuna in Bhagavad-Gita. Arjuna has claimed he's not going to fight. And then after saying that, he asks Krishna to please instruct him, that he is willing to place his thinking at the feet of Krishna and accept whatever Krishna wants to tell him. And so that's what happens then. Krishna takes over and begins to describe the process of devotional service. Now, we're in chapter 4 here, which is called Transcendental Knowledge. Before this chapter was chapter 3, which was called Karma Yoga. And after this chapter, chapter 5, there's a chapter called Karma Yoga Action in Krishna Consciousness. So chapter 3 and chapter 5 are very similar. In fact, in one sense they could be considered the same, with just this interlude of chapter 4 sort of sandwiched between them. And the reason Krishna is describing knowledge is in chapter 3, text 30. Krishna asked Arjuna to fight with knowledge. So now in this chapter 4, he's describing that knowledge that Krishna is asking Arjuna to fight in. He's not just asking him to fight like some kind of robot or some kind of blind follower, but he's asking him to fight with knowledge. So this concept here that's being talked about in the first 3 verses of this chapter, verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3, is the idea of transcendental knowledge and where does it come from. So technically, this is kind of an epistemic part of the Bhagavad-Gita. Epistemology, maybe some of you know, is the study of what knowledge is, where it comes from, and to what extent we can trust it. So this is the idea of epistemology, the study of knowledge, where it comes from, what its nature is, and to what extent we can trust it. So epistemology is generally accepted as an important part of philosophy, because along with talking about knowledge, we have to have some concept of what we mean when we use the word knowledge. And particularly today, our focus will be with knowledge, where does it come from? And, you know, it's reasonable to ask the question. We're listening to this Bhagavad-Gita. Why should we care? Where is this? Where do these ideas come from? Are we reasonable? Are we actually within a some kind of plausibility to be able to trust what we're hearing? After all, this was discussed 5,000 years ago. Is it relevant to today? These are all important and reasonable questions, and these are all epistemic questions. You know, it's come from 5,000 years ago. Why should we care? Is it applicable today? What is the credentials that we could listen to this knowledge and feel that we're getting something out of it, that we're not just listening to mythology, or we're not just listening to some ancient ideas that are completely out of date. But of course, we could ask this same question about any knowledge, that we're hearing, knowledge that we hear today, knowledge that someone may be speaking in any platform. And I think that's an important thing to think about. If we look at our own Western traditional sources of knowledge, usually when people study the idea of philosophical knowledge in our Western tradition goes back to the Greeks. And the Greeks were the beginning of the way that we think today. And many of us probably have never thought about it. But if you grew up in the Western world, Europe, the Americas, Oceania, or any of those kind of modern places, this kind of leaves out India and it leaves out the Orient, whereas a different kind of philosophical foundation is there in the history. If you grew up in the Western tradition, you are, without knowing it, influenced by Greek thinking that later became European thinking, that later became world thinking. And this is why oftentimes when we hear Vedic knowledge, certainly when devotees were first hearing Prabhupada discuss things, they misunderstood lots of things. And it's easy to misunderstand what the Vedas are actually saying because we have already a foundational understanding of the philosophy that we kind of have churning around in our mind. Now, some people may actually very thoroughly think about philosophy in a detailed way, while others just kind of have a few bits and bobs of philosophy floating around in their mind, and they never really come to any overall perspective of anything. But in any case, many commonly said things, many commonly discussed things, and many principles are just taken for granted in our everyday thinking. And these ideas and principles aren't there by accident. They're there because Western thinking has a sequence. It has a long history. And many people over the centuries debated certain issues and took what was there given to them and tried to come up with answers for questions and various controversies that had been there before. They tried to resolve them in various ways. And so today we have the descendants of these philosophical ideas that were originally given to us by the Greeks, at least if you're coming from Western philosophy. What I find kind of hard to take is that if you study or you do some reading into Western philosophy, you'll see how Western philosophy completely ignores the Vedas, almost completely, even though it's quite obvious that the Greeks borrowed a lot from the Vedic literature. But the Greeks only had fragments of what the Vedic literature gives us. They only had fragments of it. And, someone can accuse us or a person like myself, we're partial to a particular view, or we have been somehow or other influenced, and now we're, in some kind of chauvinistic way beating the drum for a Vedic thinking. But actually, if you make a study of Vedic knowledge, and you make a study of the Greeks and their various theories and ideas, you'll discover that obviously one of them is a complete picture and the other is just pieces of a complete picture. The Greeks got some things, they didn't have other things, they made up things to fill in the blanks, and it didn't work. And today, we still have issues in philosophy that many people have no answers for. But that's because they're coming completely through the legacy, this historic legacy, that's come to us from the Greeks. And if we look at the ancient Greeks, we see a lot of interesting things. For instance, generally the Greeks worshipped various demigods. Now, these are the same demigods they worship in India today. I don't think in Greece people worship demigods much anymore, if at all. But in India they still do. And although they had different names, these same people that the Greeks in general were worshipping were the same group of people that in India they worship. And for that matter, it wasn't just India and Greece, but Scandinavia, you had demigods. The Romans had demigods. The Polynesians had demigods. American Indians had demigods. In Africa, they had demigods. So this idea of worshiping some group of people that had power over the workings of this universe that we live in was pretty much spread throughout the entire planet. And you could build a case that there was a lot of similarity between the way that these people were described and what they did and how they interacted with one another. Of course, with the advent of the Christian era, demigods were pushed to the back and finally kind of debunked, at least according to not only Christian thinking, but modern scientific thinking. But there's no reason to think that there are not controllers of the universe. And certainly all of our ancestors thought so, no matter what part of the world you come from. So I don't want to really belabor that point because that's a whole point in itself. But what I do want to talk about is the fact that, well, with the beginning of Greek philosophy, there was this idea of putting aside these demigods. Xenophanes was one of the early pre-Socratic Greeks who did not find anything useful in worshiping demigods. We see that the beginning of Greek philosophy, these early pre-Socratics, they all were united on the fact, for the most part, that they were not interested in the demigods. They wanted to find some other causes for what's going on in the world other than some kind of supernatural beings, be it a god or be it many gods. So this is why, and this is precisely why, modern academia in colleges, if you learn philosophy, this is precisely why people will give great respect to the Greeks, because they put aside supernatural or personal causes and began to try to explain and describe the universe completely from the standpoint of non-personal and non-supernatural causes. Of course, you can't get away from some kind of metaphysics or some kind of special stuff somewhere along the line. But they tried to put aside this thinking that there is a being. They tried to put aside the thinking that there are possibly many beings, and that they have some sway over the way both the universe is created and both the way that it works. And just stop and think about that for a minute, because this is exactly why some people are hard-nosed materialists. They believe there is only matter, and the workings of matter are as far as you need to go. You don't need to understand anything else. That if you study physics, if you study chemistry, and you understand those laws, then you have pretty much understood as much as modern humans understand about the world around us. And they never realize that they have left aside a huge amount of things that they have not talked about at all. A huge amount of things that are off their radar completely. So the modern materialistic, mechanistic view of things is a view that goes back to the Greeks. It goes back to this idea that there are no potentates or powerful beings, that there's no certainly any single individual being, but there is something that the world or the universe springs from, and mostly it can be described by ideas, and in the modern day by material ideas that only describe matter. But of course, what did the Greeks actually think? That everything comes from something. They were fixed on that. Now, this is even our Greek philosophers who had given up any thinking about demigods. These Greek philosophers, they thought everything must come from something, which they called the arche. Some kind of something, We can see that basically they borrowed the concept of the Brahman from Indian thinking, but they didn't call it that. And they weren't clear as to what it was, that there is some kind of all one, and everything must come from that all one. So if everything comes from an all one, then everything is connected in some kind of way. And they wanted to understand what that all one is. Now, what did they think that all one could be? Now, interesting again, the Greek philosophers, they had elements that they believed in. They believed in earth, water, fire, and air. Sound familiar? Now, this is obviously from Bhagavad-Gita, Bhumir apo nalo vayu kamana buddhirevacha hankaram itiyame binna prakritirashtada. So Krishna explains in 7th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita, there is Bhumir, earth, apo, water, analo, fire, vayu, air, kam is ether. So these things are described, and these are fairly basic concepts in the Vedic tradition, that there is solid substances, gaseous substances, there is energy, and there is liquid substance. So these are basic things. Now, for some reason, the Greeks didn't like ether. They don't talk about it. But they had earth, water, fire, and air. And among the early Greeks, they had big shootout at OK Corral as to, well, which one of these is the arche, the primal? Is it air? Is it water? Is it fire? If everything's all one, it must come from one something. So is it that air produces fire and water? Or is it water producing air and fire? Or is it fire producing air and water? So, and earth, you know. So at any rate, they didn't have a clear idea of which comes first. However, in Srimad Bhagavatam, this is described, that from sound we get ether, from ether we get air, from air we get form, and from form we get fire, from fire we get it goes on, you know. It's described that there's a whole cascade of how from the Brahman we get next what we call the Pradhan, and from the Pradhan we get the Mahatat. From the Mahatat, then we get finally various elements. So it starts off as just this Brahman, which is actually spiritual, but it becomes materialized into something we call the Pradhan. So from the Brahman we get the Pradhan, and then from the Pradhan we get earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. We get these other elements. So they gradually come one from another. So from a non-differentiated whole, we get these constituent parts. And we get this differentiated universe that we actually see all around us. And this is how the Vedic literature describes it. The Greeks didn't know this. And so they didn't know where to go with this idea of how the all one is done. Now, if someone makes the argument that, well, all this stuff comes from long ago, and how do we know if it has any value today? Well, how do we know if the Greek stuff has any value today? The reason it has value today is people are still talking about it. That nobody has completely thrown out the Greeks, although we find that many ideas that they came up with have been supplanted or modified. But the ideas that they came up with, you know, in 2,500 years ago or so, are still being talked about. And so that should make us think. Now, with the Vedas, it's the same way, even more so, that these ideas between Arjuna and Krishna are still being talked about today. There is very compelling evidence that if you try to understand this world system, this philosophy, if you try to understand it, you will discover that it's reasonable, and that it's self-consistent, and that it actually is fairly exhaustive. It does explain so many things. So for that reason, even if, you know, somebody came off the street, you know, in rags and handed us this book, you know, and said, I think this is great. Even if we didn't know where it came from, if we had all kinds of doubts, what's compelling about it is that it's expansive, it's self-consistent, and it's plausible. And that's the reason why, even though these ideas come from 5,000 years ago, that today we're still talking about them. At least some people are. Again, Western culture is pretty blind to Vedic knowledge for the most part. Western culture usually doesn't discuss it. If you take a philosophy class in academia, you will not generally hear much about Vedic knowledge. And what you do hear will be mostly misunderstood explanation of the Vedic knowledge. And it is true that in India, generally people don't understand the Vedas there either, any more than in the Western world most people understand Christianity. For the most part, people have never made a systematic understanding of these philosophical traditions. They're rich, and people don't understand them. So it's reasonable to ask, what can we make of these ideas? Can we put them into our daily thinking? Can we actually act on them? And the answer is actually yes. We suggest even that Krishna is speaking to Arjuna, not just some metaphysical principles that have no application, but he's speaking things that actually can be used in everyday life and can make your life better and can help you understand the bewildering, strange way that the world that we find ourselves in works. It's quite obvious that the world works in a way that does not seem straightforward at all. And things happen for reasons that strike us as bizarre or obscure. When we see things happen, we wonder, why does it happen like that? But there are reasons for the way things happen. And of course, as we were saying, the Greeks tried to figure them out. And they got some ideas. And it's quite reasonable and quite probable that some of the ideas they came up with were ideas that were pollinated from the Vedic knowledge of India. However, they didn't have the whole picture. And so they weren't able to give a full account of how our world comes about and how our world works. So later philosophers, Germans and British, etc., they added layers and layers on that, and then we have various things that exist today. And we see that there are there are competing schools in various philosophy. Some people say it's like this, some people say it's like that, and who decides at the end? Which philosophy do we go for? So, although this was spoken 5,000 years ago, if we today take Greek philosophy seriously from 2,500 years ago, then we should seriously think, well, why not take a look at the Vedic philosophy? Now, many times it's said that the early pre-Socratics, they didn't have a full philosophy, but later Greek philosophy became more complete. But compared to the Vedic philosophy, even whatever the Greeks had is just, a group of fragments. So this is something that we need to think about. That's why I was talking about this idea of epistemology. We are discovering, well, why should we believe what we're hearing? Where does it come from? And what are its credentials? And so in chapter 4, Krishna is explaining to Arjuna that he first explained the Vedic science to the sun god Vivaswan. And Vivaswan explained it to Manu, and Manu explained it to Ikshvaku. So we have this knowledge being handed down. Then we hear something puzzling and maybe even distressing, that the knowledge is lost. Krishna says that I describe this knowledge, but today the knowledge appears to be lost. So I'm again describing it to you, Arjuna. So what this means is that we live in a strange and funny universe. And it seems odd that there's no explanation for how this universe got here or what we're supposed to do in it. But actually there is. There is an explanation of how this universe got here and what we're supposed to do in it. However, as the years go by, as the centuries go by, this knowledge becomes more and more diffused, covered with misconceptions, and eventually gets submerged altogether, and people lose track of it altogether, which is certainly what happens in our particular time here. We're in Kali Yuga, and in Kali Yuga, it is the time when the darkness of ignorance becomes the most pervasive, the most thick. So in Kali Yuga, we lose track of the true knowledge more than we do at any other time. But that doesn't mean everybody loses track of the knowledge, but most lose track of the knowledge. So this is the nature of how the process of spiritual life unfolds, that we have a time where most people are aware of basic knowledge of spiritual life, of the universe, how it came to be, what we need to do in it, and then gradually by degrees that knowledge gets broken, lost, misconceived, and we come to the point where we have a world where almost everybody has no conception of how we got here, what we're doing here, etc., etc. So Krishna explains that. It's not a mystery, and it's actually built into the system. And we could ask, well, why is it like that? Why do we have knowledge and then that knowledge gets taken away? Especially if it's important knowledge for what we're doing and how things work. And of course the reason is that we have knowledge or we have ignorance according to our desires. So Krishna is explaining in Bhagavad-Gita that mata smritir jnanam apohanam cha vedascha sarvairaham eva vedya vedanta krit veda videva chaham sarvasya chaham hridi sanivishtu mata smritir jnanam apohanam cha. So for me come knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. So Krishna is giving what you want. If you want to enjoy in this material world, and you want to ignore any relationship with God, if you want to ignore any duties incumbent upon you, then you're saying, I want ignorance. And Krishna's saying, you really sure you want ignorance? And you're saying, no, I'm sure I want ignorance. Give it to me. And so Krishna, all right, there it is. The fog rolls right in, and wow, I don't know nothing no more. I'm just bewildered, But on the other side of the coin, if you want knowledge, then Krishna gradually lifts the fog and gives you the knowledge. It's owing to your desire. So we have free will. And if we want to understand what's really going on in this world, then we can understand it. And Krishna will gradually help us to become more and more aware of what's really going on. However, if we prefer to try to just enjoy the sugar plums and cherries of the world that we live in, in our little plate, then Krishna will say, all right, you're sure you want to do that? And to do that for a long period of time, you need some ignorance, because otherwise you'll realize that the material world is full of undesirable things. And even those things that we want when we get them, they don't satisfy us. They're mixed with things we don't want. We've always got flies in our soup and all that kind of thing. And the material world gives us sometimes perversely exactly what we don't want. So all these things are part of it. And that's why Krishna is speaking to Arjuna. He's saying, because you are my friend, you are not demoniac, I'm giving you this knowledge. Because you are my friend, you are open to this knowledge. You say you want knowledge, so I'm giving you knowledge. If Arjuna was the other way, if Arjuna was demoniac, meaning that he was selfish and uninterested in the world around him, in helping others, or in becoming the best person he could be, if Arjuna was uninterested in that, then Krishna wouldn't be speaking to him. He wouldn't be giving him this information. So I'm going to put a bookmark there and ask and see if we have any questions from our group here. Anybody? I tried to do something a little different today. I wanted to contrast and compare the Vedic traditional explanation of the universe with the more commonly understood, either subconsciously or consciously, presentation of Western philosophy. So, yeah.
So, Marge, thanks. Very, very intellectually stimulating explanation you're providing in a spiritual way. So my question is, well, based on our Western or materialistic, however you want to call it, our way of thinking about knowledge, knowledge does not depend on any emotions, let alone devotion or friendship, in towards God, so, to friendship to God.
Mm.
So, how does it make sense that one needs to have devotion to Krishna, to be friendly towards Krishna, in order to understand these teachings?
Right. This gets back into, as I was just mentioning, the difference between what we mean by knowledge when we talk about it in the Vedic tradition and what we mean by knowledge when we talk about it in the Western tradition. These are two complete different concepts, and I say that there are four commonly used, completely misunderstood concepts in the Western world. That is love, freedom, knowledge, and happiness. That everybody thinks they know what they mean when they say knowledge or happiness or love or freedom. But if you ask them a few questions about it, you'll realize they don't have any clue of what they're talking about when they're talking about these things. In the Western world, knowledge generally means, first, usually it means particular information according to a particular occupation. I have knowledge of quantum physics, or I understand how auto mechanics works, or I'm a computer tech. I understand various computer systems. So that's generally what people think of as knowledge. And beyond that, they think of some basic, philosophical dips and dribbles, and so this kind of knowledge, certainly you can get just by trying to school yourself in them, either by going to a college or reading books, etc. But if you read in Bhagavad-Gita, Krishna describes what knowledge is. And it strikes us as very different sounding than that, I'm trying to remember where that verse is, where Krishna describes knowledge. He describes 20 things, more or less, which comprise knowledge. It may be in this chapter, as a matter of fact. Let me see if I can find it.
Text 8 through 12 of chapter 13, March?
Oh, that may be what I'm talking about. Let me see if we
I
can
think
get
so, yeah.
Chapter 13, yeah, I
20
think so.
qualities, and I
Right.
declare these to be knowledge.
Right. 13, what is it?
8 through 12, March?
Right. So, this is huge verse. Humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest, even-mindedness amidst pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to me, aspiring to live in a solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization, and the philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I declare to be knowledge, and besides this, whatever else there may be is ignorance. So that's a very different explanation of knowledge. And we see that we could put it in more simple terms by saying that in the Western view, knowledge means that which helps me to enjoy my senses. That's essentially that information which I can use as a tool that helps me to enjoy my body, my senses in a better way. That's what knowledge means. And certainly you don't have to have any, connection with Krishna for that. As a matter of fact, it probably helps if you don't. Now, what we mean by knowledge is knowledge of what's actually going on here and how to deliver ourselves from the material confusion and entanglement. That's a very different concept of knowledge. And for that, certainly you do need to be favorable to Krishna. Because if you don't have the final thing to connect everything to, whatever knowledge you have is only sort of free and floating. It's not anchored to anything. And it will ultimately not give you anything substantial that will last the years or help you in your dark hour. So this is again why these two concepts of knowledge are very different. In the Western world, in materialistic thinking, knowledge means to help me to enjoy my senses. In the Vedic perspective, in the spiritual view, knowledge means to help me get out of the predicament that I'm in. I was just thinking, today that when we were in the spiritual world, we were with the Supreme, and we became envious. We were thinking, well, why does Krishna always have to be at the center of everything? Why can't I be at the center? And so, therefore, we get pushed out of the material world, and we come here. And I was thinking, as we fall here, the radio is playing I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. And then after we knock around in this material world for thousands and thousands of lifetimes, and we discover that everything is a mess here, then the radio starts playing the song by the Eric Burdon and the Animals, "We Gotta Get Out of This Place." So we come here, and we think we're going to enjoy, but we can't get any satisfaction when we're here. And then after some time, we come to the stage where we recognize that there's something wrong about this place, and there's no way to completely fix it. The only way is to get out of it, and that way is to go back to the spiritual world. But to go back to the spiritual world, again, we have to be favorable to Krishna. You can't go back there if you really don't want to be connected with Krishna, if you don't want to serve Krishna, if you're not favorable to Krishna. You wouldn't like it there. They wouldn't want you there. So that again is why we're saying that Krishna is saying, I'm giving you this knowledge because you are my friend. Yes.
So in both of the last answers that you gave, you said that you need to be connected to the final truth,
Right.
And our practical minds, when we are starting out, we're like, okay, I want to develop faith. I do feel peaceful certain times when I think about it, but how do you actually develop complete surrender to the knowledge, or how do you completely trust the process or trust Krishna, or because the practicality overtakes, right, a lot of times, or maybe that's called material world, I'm not sure, but how do you flow in the process?
Right.
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
I should have been having people this is.
I can pass it around.
Okay.
If you
So,
like, Marge.
Well, maybe it was pointed at you. I forgot that I have this other little microphone that I pass around, not to amplify people, but because this will get uploaded. That way your questions get heard by the audience out there in YouTube land, So, at any rate, Prabhupada always taught us that you don't accept Vedic knowledge blindly, nor can you accept it wholeheartedly. You can't accept anything wholeheartedly just from the very first time, or even in the beginning of hearing about something. Something has to gradually become close to you. This knowledge, this process has to gradually sort of seep in. And as it does, we become more committed to it, we become more aware of it, and it has an effect on us that's much more profound. It gradually grows. Just like if you were going to go to college and you were wondering, well, what college should I go to? Well, you could ask around, and different people could suggest various different colleges that you could attend. And you could make a reasonable assessment of what different people told you about the various colleges and their ranking and their curriculum and their efficacy and their standing, etc. But ultimately, you're going to have to go to the college, and then you'll get a sense of whether what you were hearing about the college is correct or it's completely off the mark, And you're not going to know by your first week or two in the college which of the two it is, You're going to have to go for some time. So similarly, we say that there's a distinction between what we call Gyan and what we call Vigyan. Vigyan is realized knowledge, and Gyan is theoretical knowledge. In the beginning, we hear Vedic ideas, we hear the processes described, and these are theoretical to us. We understand them at least superficially. We understand the theory of what they are and how they work, but then we actually have to do them. We have to implement them, to deploy them in our lives. And when we do that, then we begin to get the understanding of, well, is this just a bunch of hot air, or does this really work? And The reason some of us have been here so long is because obviously the answer for us was that it worked, And as you continue, you want to go deeper. And as time goes on, you become more and more convinced that there really isn't anything else. That, people can talk about other philosophies, and you can hear from others, various other philosophies, and you can report back. But after some time, you become convinced that there's no other philosophy like this anywhere in the world, nor is there anything that's as practical for cleansing your life, for cleansing your consciousness, and for actually making you tangibly happy. It's, as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. So we can talk about it, we can philosophize or conceptualize about it, but ultimately what we need to do is to hypothetically accept, well, this sounds good, seems reasonable, let me give it a whirl. So we try it, and we try it for a while, and we see, are we becoming purified? Are we becoming happier? Do we get deeper realization of the same things that are being talked about? And if so, well, maybe this is actually worth investing deeper in. So that's how I would respond to your question. Does that?
Yeah, answers.
Okay. Yes, we have a question back. Now we. Okay.
From here. So, I was wondering, in the 5 elements that you mentioned, like the earth, fire, water, etc., where do the 3 gunas fit in how Krishna puts it into the universe?
Yeah, okay. So it's described that in the beginning of creation, this is explained in 2 or 3 places in Srimad Bhagavatam, that there is, first of all, well, let me go to the Brahma Samhita, where it says, what is it? Yasya prabhavato jagadanda koti svaseshu vasudadi vibhuti binam tam brahma nishkalam anantanam cha, something like that. Govindam adipurusham tamaham bhajami. That the Supreme Lord Krishna, his effulgence is the Brahman. And it's from this Brahman that the material universes are generated. So, the Pradhan is the undifferentiated material version of the what we call the Brahman. So, it is non-differentiated. It's one homogeneous energy. Something like the white light. The Brahman is the white light. So the Pradhan is something like that. And it has no directions. It has no specifics. It has no details. It is just a homogeneous energy. Now, when the Supreme Lord glances at it, it becomes agitated. And when it becomes agitated, it begins to separate out into the 3 gunas, the mode of passion, the mode of ignorance, and the mode of goodness, rajas, tamas, and sattva. So it begins to separate. And then false ego is generated, ahankara. And from ahankara, false ego, and it merges again with the mode of ignorance, and the material elements are created with that merging, So first you have the undifferentiated, then you have the false ego, then you have the three modes, and then after the three modes are created, the mode of ignorance of the three modes merges with the false ego and creates the material elements. That's where their origin is. Now, there's other things. When the mode of goodness merges with the false ego, then the demigods are created. When the mode of passion merges with the false ego, we get the senses are created, the 5 knowledge-acquiring senses and the 5 working senses, etc. So this is kind of described as an unfolding process, and the details are given in Srimad Bhagavatam in 2 or 3 different places. It describes this whole unfolding process of how we go from this kind of material homogeneous energy towards a gradual, these are all very abstract energies still, the false ego and the 3 modes of nature. And then eventually we get the universe the way we see it today. These energies differentiate out and they become more specific, and then they interact with one another in a very specific way, and we see the universe that we see today. That's kind of giving you a sort of a summary, but not much more I can give you as far as that goes. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah.
And I might be rather ignorant in this.
We're going to bring you this to speak
Okay.
so the people on the left can hear.
Yes, I have a question, and I might be rather ignorant, and I'm going to apologize in advance. But I had yesterday.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I had yesterday a discussion with a, not a guru, but a spiritual leader. I think there's a word for that.
Mm-hmm.
Who I ask sometimes when I have a question. And we were also talking about the path. How do you know that you're on the right path? Or how do you devote yourself to what you'd like to do? And we talked about pain and pleasure, and actually the path, you're on the path when you're actually neutral. Now, if I understood you correctly, what you were describing earlier, when you feel happy or when you feel you're in a spot where you want to be, that doesn't sound like neutral.
Mhm.
That sounds like another way of saying you want to be over there rather than where you are. You want to be over there rather than where you are.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not sure if I understand it correctly.
Right. No, what you've said is a kind of thing that I think a lot of people, when they're first learning something about spiritual life, a kind of issue that they come onto. Now, the first question that you have to ask yourself is, what is my real ultimate goal? And you'll find that people, especially in India, there are all kinds of spiritual practices and teachers there. Some that are traditional, some that are not at all traditional, some that are making it up as they go along, and so forth. So the question then is, the central question is, what do I really want? Do I want to be even? Do I want to be delivered? Do I want to serve the Supreme Lord, the Supreme God? Because depending on what you want is the kind of path you're going to go towards, or you should go towards. No point in accepting one kind of a path that actually goes towards a different goal than the one that you've actually set for yourself. Now, what we're suggesting here is the highest and only true goal is to develop a deep, loving relationship with God. That's the highest goal. It's not to be even. It's not to go to the heavenly worlds. It's not to become famous. It's not to develop mystic powers. It's not to find yourself in in a state of mind where nothing either affects you or disaffects you, those are not goals. I mean, they can be for some people, but we claim that such things are not actual real goals, you know. Now, we are saying that to be totally devoted to God, one has to be totally free from material desire. Now, we're saying here, material desire. Now, there is such a thing as spiritual desire, because being free from desire, nobody can be at any time, anywhere in the universe, because even if you want to be free from desire, that's still a desire, to be free from desire. So everybody has some kind of desire. Now the question is, what's a material desire and what's a spiritual desire? And we're saying that we're trying to get rid of material desires, not spiritual desires. So spiritual desires have a place. And what is the spiritual desire? The spiritual desire is to want to please the Supreme Lord. Now, it is true that we want to please the Supreme Lord, and we don't exactly care where that leaves us, because the idea of serving the Lord means we are serving the Lord without motivation and without interruption. So we're not serving God because then God will turn around and make us happy or make the world a bed of roses for us. That's not why we're serving God. We're serving God because it makes Him happy. And but paradoxically, when you make the Supreme Lord happy, you automatically become happy yourself, because you're a particle of the Supreme Lord. So if you are working at trying to please the Supreme Lord, automatically, even without any separate endeavor, you yourself will become happy. It's a byproduct, but it's not the goal of why we're doing that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay.
Marjan, this can be the last question. It's
Okay. All right.
This is the last question to our Krishna.
Hare Krishna Maharaj Ji, very nice.
Can you
explanation.
knock the AC down a notch or two?
Talk to Sasha. Talk to Sasha. Oh, on this side. Yeah.
Maharaj, this is not a question, this is just a comment. I just want to add, Krishna says that once you come to the material, spiritual world, by loving Him, you know, we don't, we are not subjected to 4 kinds of material miseries that you just read in 13th chapter. Janma mrityu jara vyadhi dukkha dosanudarsanam. That we don't take birth, we don't die, we don't get old, we don't get disease. So that's another advantage.
Yeah. That's the byproduct of misery in the material world comes from our sinful action feeding back into our lives. That's called karma. Excuse me. When you do wrong things, then as a result of doing wrong things, your sinful wrong action causes you to suffer. So if you're not doing sinful things because you're serving the Supreme Lord, then naturally your suffering automatically lessens. You don't find as much suffering in your life. It's a automatic, another byproduct of the process of Krishna consciousness. Okay. So you're saying now we should do the
Kirtan Maharaj.
final
Please.
kirtan.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And if